Hello and welcome everyone to our weekly session titled Latest in Bitcoin Tech, where we go through the weekly Bitcoin Optech newsletter number. This week it's number 351, published on 25th of April. So this newsletter basically it entails, it comprises of whatever latest evolutions have happened or are happening in the world of Bitcoin tech. If you want to stay familiar, if you want to familiarize yourselves with it, then this newsletter is for you. It primarily entails a news section. Then there this week we have a Q&A from Bitcoin Stack Exchange, which is a monthly feature. So there's this website called Bitcoin Stack Exchange where people post their questions and get answers, right? So a handful of questions are picked and included in the newsletter once every month. So this week's edition is the one that contains these questions and answers. Then you have releases and release candidates that mention or that include what new software pertaining to Bitcoin or Lightning is staged to be released or has been released. Then we have notable code and documentation changes, which usually cover the pull requests for Bitcoin clients and Lightning clients, right? So we have primarily we'll cover two news articles and Stack Exchange questions and answers. Usually, Stack Exchange questions and answers, I believe, are more beneficial for all participants because they cover a very diverse uh, uh, section of topics. So in 45 minutes, we can cover a lot of topics. So they might excite the listeners more. And I usually am inclined always towards spending more time with Bitcoin Stack Exchange questions and answers. So we'll do that. We'll repeat that ritual of giving the majority of the time to this section, but at least let's take one of the news articles, right? We'll not go into the details of the news articles because they're very uh, technically dense, might not be of utmost interest to the audience. And if it is, then they can dig into it on their own. We'll probably take the first news article and try and understand it on the surface level, what it entails, how it affects Bitcoin software architecture, and then probably we'll move over to the Bitcoin Stack Exchange questions and answers. For those of you who are not familiar with the format, okay, if you at any point in time have a question, have something to share, have your thoughts about a proposal, please feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt me. You don't have to wait for me to stop. You don't have to raise your hand or anything of that sort, right? Just unmute yourself and interrupt me if you have a question, if you have anything to share, if you have anything to ask, if you have anything to put forward pertaining the topic that we are covering, feel free to interrupt. It's a very I won't say a casual session, but yeah, I mean we don't have such strict protocols that when one person is speaking, the other can't. So just feel free to casually intervene and ask for access to speak, and I'd be more than happy to let you over. But since I don't have access to the chat, I'm sharing my screen. I can't see what you're posting in the chat. So I won't be able to look at the chat and answer your questions very frequently. So just feel free to unmute yourself. We'll read the news article, the first one, and then try and dissect it and see what we can make of it. So the title is Interactive Aggregate Signatures Compatible with SEC P256K1. Jonas Nick, Tim Ruffing, Yannick Serin posted to the Bitcoin dev mailing list to announce a paper they've written about creating 64-byte aggregate signatures compatible with the cryptographic primitives already used by Bitcoin. Aggregate signatures are the cryptographic requirement for cross-input signature aggregation, a feature proposed for Bitcoin that could reduce the size of transactions with multiple inputs, which would reduce the cost of many different types of spending, including privacy-enhanced spending through coin joins and pay joins. In addition to an aggregate signature scheme like Dahlia's scheme proposed by the authors, adding support to CISA Adding support for CISA to Bitcoin would require a consensus change and possible interactions between signature aggregation and other proposed consensus changes that may warrant further study, right? So let's start from the bottom because there are new folks as well. We know that uh, uh, I mean, if you look at the anatomy of a Bitcoin transaction, it contains of a lot of things, right? A Bitcoin transaction has a version number, it has an address to which it's paying, and it has inputs and it has outputs as well, right? Now, all of those inputs need to be signed, right? Because if I am spending my Bitcoin, then I need to authorize. And that only happens with a digital signature. Just like you have a signature in the real world, if you want to authorize a payment from your bank account, you have to sign your check. Likewise, if you want to authorize your Bitcoin payment, then you have to sign your input. You have to authorize that you have to firstly prove that you are the legitimate owner of the Bitcoin, and then you want to transfer the ownership of that Bitcoin to somebody else, right? So for that, we have this process of digital signature where you create a digital signature from your private key, which is a secret, which is analogous to the password in the real world, right? So you create a digital signature, you sign your transaction, and then you send the transaction to whoever you wanted to, right? Now in Bitcoin, what happens is that every input has an individual signature. Okay, so there's a signature that corresponds to each input. Number of signatures go up with the number of inputs. Okay, and if you look at the anatomy of a Bitcoin transaction, signatures are usually the most, the most data intensive field of a Bitcoin transaction, right? So it's usually the signature that makes the transaction heavy. It's usually the signature that makes the transaction heavy. So the majority of the size of a transaction is usually, not always, but usually usurped by the signature. So the more the number of inputs you have in a Bitcoin transaction, the more the number of signatures you have, and the more the number of signatures you have, the more hefty or the more voluminous or the more sizable the transaction becomes. And in Bitcoin, your fee varies in accordance with the size of the transaction, right? Not the amount of the transaction. Like in the real world, it might be the fee that you pay to route your transaction might correspond to the amount. So if you want to route a small amount, you might have to pay a small fee, and if you want to route a large amount, then you have to pay a large fee, right? But in Bitcoin, your amount is irrelevant. The size of the transaction is what matters, right? Because you're propagating data across the network. So the more data you are propagating, the more common resources like bandwidth and block space that you are occupying, the more you have to pay the fee. So if you have a Bitcoin transaction with multiple inputs and multiple signatures, it means that the size of the transaction will go up considerably. Thereby, you will have to pay a high fee. Thereby, you'll have to pay a high fee because, as I said, the signatures usually usurp the maximum amount of size in any Bitcoin transaction. What is the solution? One of the solutions is to aggregate signatures. Right? So initially, we had Bitcoin signatures which were governed by a scheme known as ECDSA. And ECDSA did not allow signature aggregation. So let's say there's one input, okay, which is co-owned by three people. All three people want to sign that input, right? All three people will have to sign that input in order for them to transfer the ownership of that input to some other person, right? So person A will sign, person B will sign, person three will sign, right? So there'll be three signs. Even though there's one single input, there'll be three signs. If three people jointly own that input, all three of them will have to sign it, right? What will happen? Now, due to this, obviously the transaction will become voluminous because it contains only one input, but it contains three digital signatures. So that's why the size of the transaction will go up. When the size of the transaction goes up, the block space that it utilizes also goes up. And we all know that block space is a finite resource, right? Your mempool is a finite resource. Your mempool is basically a staging area where your transactions are staged before they are confirmed, right? So if you want to go to the bank, you have to stand in the queue. If you want to deposit cash, you have to stand in the queue, right? So mempool is the real world analog of mempool is the Bitcoin analog of a queue, right? So when you want to broadcast a transaction, your transactions wait in a staging area, which is known as a mempool. From the mempool, the miners pick those transactions and they include it in a block. Now the mempool is finite. The default size of the mempool for most popular clients of Bitcoin is 300 MB, right? So that's a finite space. So there's only a number of transactions that you can fit into it. And the block space, as most of us must be knowing, is also finite. It's 4,000 weight units or 4 VMB, right? So there's the block size is finite and the mempool size is also finite. And that is why it's very important that we keep the data as compact as possible. If the size of Bitcoin transactions go up exponentially, we will not be able to increase the block size or the mempool size or the disk storage in direct proportion because all of that induces costs. So we want to ensure that Bitcoin transactions are as concise, as small, as compact in size as possible, right? So, like I said, if there's one input which is co-owned by three people, all three have to sign. It means three digital signatures. It means the size goes up, right? So we have to do something to reduce the size. There comes into picture Schnorr signatures, right? So initially we had these ECDSA signatures, right? We had a set of protocols or standards with which Bitcoin signatures had to abide by. But these signatures did not allow aggregation, right? So if three people own an input, all three will have to individually sign that input. And all those three individual signatures will be propagated across the network. All those three individual signatures will be stored on the blockchain. However, then came into the picture a Schnorr signature, right? Schnorr signatures, what did Schnorr signatures enable? They basically enabled signature aggregation. They enabled public key aggregation and digital signature aggregation. So if three people own a signature or own an input together, they can just use one signature, right? So person A will sign, person B will sign, person C will sign, and they will aggregate that signature. They will quote unquote concatenate that signature and it will appear as though it's one single signature, right? Initially, step one was what? If three people owned an input and they wanted to sign that input, all three of them had to individually sign. So we had three digital signatures. That is ECDSA. Then we upgraded to something known as Schnorr signatures. What do Schnorr signatures do? They allow you to aggregate your signatures. So if three people are signing one input, all three of them can aggregate their signature, meaning concatenate that signature, quote unquote. Okay, and it'll appear on the blockchain as though it's one single signature, right? Now, how is this beneficial? It obviously reduces size, right? Initially, you had to propagate three different digital signatures. Now you're propagating just one signature, right? All three people are signing, but they're aggregating their signatures into one single signature. So the size is of the transaction is reduced. The fee that you have to pay is reduced. The block space that the transactions uh, 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 occupy reduces, and thus more transactions can be fit into blocks. So this is known as signature aggregation, right? Now, what happens here is that even though you can aggregate digital signatures, but you can aggregate digital signatures only for one input, right? So if one transaction has two inputs, right? For one input, if three people are signing, you can aggregate their signatures. That becomes one. But if there is another input, then again, for that second input, you will have to aggregate signatures again. So if there's one input, there's one aggregated signature. If there are two inputs, there are two aggregated signatures. If there are three inputs, there are three aggregated signatures, right? So first step was that, let's say three people own an input, three more people own an input, right? So in that transaction, we have two inputs, but six signatures. The second stage was Schnorr signatures, where all three of them aggregated their signature, but the aggregation was confined to input level. So if we have two inputs, we have two signatures. So we came down from six to two. Now we want to come down even further, right? For two inputs, we want one single aggregated signature, right? If those two inputs are a part of a single transaction and then being broadcasted together, then we want just one signature for both the inputs. Even if three people are signing, five are signing, 10 are signing, we want just one signature, right? All those people will come together. They will sign individually, but they will use some cryptography that aggregates their signature, combines their signature into one single signature, right, into one single signature. So that is what is referred to as cross input signature aggregations. First we had ECDSA signatures, then we had aggregated Schnorr signatures. Now we have, or we are in process to incorporate cross input signature aggregation, which is what, which is aggregating multiple digital signatures for different outputs as well. That's what cross input signature aggregation is, right? Now what this does is, firstly, it reduces the size. Okay, it's 64 bytes in size. It reduces the size. It's only 64 bytes. So even if you have multiple inputs in a Bitcoin transaction which are signed by multiple people, all of those digital signatures of those multiple inputs can be aggregated together and reduced to as small as 64 bytes. Right, so we came down from like six signatures to two signatures, and now just one signature, which is merely 64 bytes, right? So it saves up a lot of size. It saves up a lot of size. Thereby, I mean, it does not congest the network. The fee that you have to pay is less. Your mempool can accommodate more transactions. The blocks can accommodate more transactions. The blockchain grows at a linear rate, thereby keeping it easier to run Bitcoin nodes, right? And especially if you're aware of these protocols like coin joins or pay joins, where multiple people where multiple people sign a transaction, you know, all of their signatures can be aggregated into one single signature, which is a huge upgrade, right? So there are people who are working on this. All right, the names are mentioned here: Jonas, Nick, Tim, Ruffing, Yannick, Siren, and they have posted an entire post explaining their proposal about how they plan to integrate these cross input aggregated signatures into Bitcoin, and what are the what are the benefits of it, and they have given some links as well. So whoever would want to explore it into more detail can look into it. The bottom line being, this news article talks about a proposal which is you can say a version of or a variant of cross input signature aggregation, which aggregates digital signatures of different inputs in the same transaction to a single digital signature of only 64 bytes, right? Where this stands out is that it is compatible with sec p256k1, right? So I believe this is not the first and the only cross input signature aggregation scheme. There are other schemes as well. However, they are not compatible with SEC P256K1. For those of you who are not aware, SEC P256K1 is the cryptographic or the elliptic curve which Bitcoin uses, right? Bitcoin uses this curve for generating private keys, for generating digital signatures, for validating digital signatures, not for generating private keys, sorry, generating public keys, right? That is what Bitcoin uses this curve for. So I believe there are other cross-input signature aggregations schemes as well, but they're not compatible with SEC P256K1. What's unique about this one is that it is compatible with SEC P256K1, meaning it can be used for uh, Bitcoin transactions as well. So if there is a Bitcoin transaction that has multiple inputs, and if this scheme is deployed, then you can aggregate all the digital signatures of different inputs into one single digital signature of merely 64 bytes, which is very handy for especially for protocols like coin joins and pay joins, right? Multiple people come together to sign a Bitcoin transaction. So that is what this news article is all about. If anybody has any questions, any queries, any observations pertaining to this, please feel free to either post in chat or unmute yourself and speak. All right, I'll just be back in a minute. I need a glass of water. In the meanwhile, if you all have any questions, I'm listening. If you all have anything to share, anything to ask, anything you want more elaboration on, or anything you want to post in chat, please feel free to do that.
Hi, I just had one basic doubt. So I don't know exactly how it works, but does cross-input signature aggregation works similar to how PSBT work, where one signer signs a transaction that's a partially signed Bitcoin transaction and it's propagated to one of the other signers of the same address? Um, yeah, if if you have if you could speak about how aggregation works, does it work off chain? Does it work through PSBT mechanism? Yeah.
I mean, if your wallet is compatible with it, then I mean, like multiple people. If there can be two situations. One situation could be that it's a transaction that is already owned by three people. Three people come together and aggregate their public keys, right? So I create my digital signature, you create your digital signature, and third person creates their digital signatures, right? And or a private keys, right? And then we create our public keys. Okay, three people create their private keys, and then they create their subsequent public keys, and then they aggregate their public key, and the transaction is sent to that. That is how we do in store signatures, right? So you create a private key, I create a private key, coding P creates a private key. You create your public key corresponding to your private key. I create a public key corresponding to my private key. Coding P creates a public key corresponding to her private key, right? Then we combine our private keys. We aggregate our private keys, and with that aggregated private key, we create a Bitcoin address, and then and then let's say a Bitcoin is sent to that address. Now, if we want to spend it further, then what we have to do is from my private key, I create my digital signature. From your private key, you create your own digital signature. From coding key's private key, she creates her own digital signature, right? And then we aggregate those digital signatures. And then using that aggregated digital signature, we have to sign that transaction, right? And it can work as a PSBT as well, right? So like they can be off-chain protocols as well, they can be on-chain protocols as well. They can be wallets that support multi-signature, that support multi-sig, where multiple people can have an account together. Or the other way could be like one person signs and sends it to the other signs and sends it to the other. That is also possible, and then you aggregate your signatures. So both the mechanisms are possible.
I mean, it's like half aggregation does not require coordination, but full aggregation requires coordination. So think about it. Like if you want to like combine your multiple UTXOs output together, and for example, in coin join, full aggregation could be applied, but that was not implemented.
You scared me, Delson,
Why?
because I wasn't expecting you. All of a sudden, I was like, who's this guy?
No, like
But yeah.
I was interested in this thing. That's why I done that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Uh, okay, let's move on to the Bitcoin Stack Exchange questions and answers. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let's see how many. I don't know. Okay, right. Let's start with this one. Where's, who's there? He's still there. I'm
He
audible,
chose the most
guys.
controversial. He chose the most controversial question in Bitcoin right now.
I wanted to take all the questions, so I'm going actually in chronology. But I thought the question at the top might not be of a huge interest to most of the listeners. So I usually pick questions that I feel that beginners might be able to relate to or non-devs will be able to relate to. And this, I don't think like this has any direct correlation with the controversy. I don't know. I think this was even published before the controversy. This newsletter was published on 25th of what do you say, April. So I think this
Right.
this predates it, right?
Okay.
Right. Cool. So let's see. What's the largest size operator ever created? Any guesses, anyone? I posted this in Discord one day. Anybody has any idea what's the largest size operator payload ever created? What's the standard size for Bitcoin Core? Anyone?
For operator, right?
Say
I think
300
84 bytes.
bytes.
Okay. How much did you say, Shyam?
84.
84.
Or
84
80.
is that?
Yeah, I think 64 or 84. I think.
No, initially it was like 40, 43, I guess. Now it is 83.
Okay. Oh, I'm close. Okay, 83.
Okay. I think I
Yeah.
heard somebody else as well, along with Delson and Shreyan. Somebody else also wanted to answer. Did I hear another voice? Anybody else would like to say? Okay, yeah, no worries. So yeah, initially it was 43, and then some clients stuck to 43. Bitcoin Core extended it to 83. Coding P I think said 80, which is also kind of correct. 80 is the space for the payload, right? So there's an opcode and there's a push data, and then there's the payload. So the actual data that an operator can contain is 83, but the size that the entire operator script occupies in the Bitcoin transaction is 83. So 80 plus 3, it's 83. So even 83 is right, even 80 is right. 80 is the payload, and 83 is the entire script size, right? So initially it was op false basically. It started as op false, and then it was converted into an opcode where people could embed data. Then it was 43 bytes, and then after that it was increased by Bitcoin Core to 83 bytes, and some clients are still using 43 bytes, some clients are using 83 bytes. Next week we don't know how many bytes we'll be using if you're running Bitcoin Core, so stay tuned. This answer might get updated next week, I don't know. So yeah, let's read the question. So what's the largest op return payload ever created in terms of pushed bytes after the op return? Not in terms of total transaction size and not in terms of amount burnt. Also just the payload itself. So excluding the data push opcodes, right? So the data push opcodes, it utilizes 3 bytes, right? So currently the payload is 80 bytes and the data push opcode is 3 bytes. So that's 83 altogether. So the questioner is asking about the payload, the size of the payload, right? They're not asking about the amount, like how many coins were burned, right? You can burn your coins as well. So they're not asking about the size of the transaction or how many coins were burned or the entire size of the script, but only the data that was put in the op return script. Since this will be a non-standard transaction, there are two categories, right? If it's above 83 bytes and if the payload is above 80 bytes and you're running Bitcoin Core, then it's a non-standard transaction, right? Depending on the client that you're using, some clients will consider more than 40 to be non-standard default configuration. Some clients will consider more than 80 to be non-standard default, right? So depending on that. But obviously, since we're talking about the largest size ever, it has to be a non-standard transaction. So the largest is push only and the largest not is push only. See why do standard op return outputs also need to be is push only. Okay, so there are basically two types of op returns. One is push only op return, meaning it only has data. It does not have any logic. Okay, it just has data. It doesn't have any logic. And if you have not is push only, then it can have logic as well. It can have logic in the script as well, right? See, why do standard operator outputs also need to be is push only? I'm curious if the latter is used at all, but my question pertains to the former. That is something a miner can create by setting data carrier size and optionally increasing max standard TX weight and no other patches. An additional distinction could be made between the largest Coinbase and non-Coinbase operator. Okay. So the questioner wants to know what's the size of the highest or the largest operator ever mined in the history of Bitcoin's blockchain or decentralized ledger. Okay, and he adds some caveats. He says that I'm not referring to the amount of coins that were burned. I'm not even referring to the size of the transaction. I don't in that sense. It requires no additional input to become valid for inclusion in the blockchain. It is anyone can spend, i.e., anyone can create an input that references the transaction output per its output and spend it with an empty input script and witness stack. Of course, every output is still unique, identified per its outpoint, can only be spent by one transaction, right? So a pay to anchor output basically it is anyone can spend output, meaning anybody can spend it. It is not locked with a specific digital signature. Rather, anybody can access that output and they can spend that output. That's known as anyone can spend. So you don't require to satisfy the script pub key, right? There's no locking script that you need to satisfy with a specific digital signature. It is and anyone can spend output because its only purpose is so that a child can be attached to it, right? So these anchors basically are put on the commitment transactions of the Lightning Network. Okay, so if you understand how the Lightning Network functions, there is a commitment transaction in the Lightning Network. If you want to opt out of the Lightning Network and you want to go back to the main chain, then you basically broadcast your commitment transaction because the fee market is dynamic. And when you pre-sign the commitment transaction on the Lightning Network, you cannot estimate the fee accurately. You usually have a very low fee that is stipulated in the pre-signed contract. And when you actually want to broadcast the transaction, you have to bump the fee. And for that, these P2A outputs are used, right? So the commitment transaction of a Lightning Network will have, for instance, a P2A output, meaning a pay to anchor output, which can be spent with as less, which can be spent with as little as 240 sats. So it has a dust limit of 240 sats, and its only purpose of existence is that you can attach a child to it. You attach a child to it, and that child pays a high fee, which makes up for the fee that the commitment transaction in the Lightning Network lacks. And that is the only purpose of having a pay to anchor output, and it's an anyone can spend output, right? So that is what pay to anchor is. Okay. This will be too long for us to read. Let's understand what ephemeral dust is. Okay. So Bitcoin Core generally requires that transaction outputs meet the dust limit, right? So depending on the script, what your script is, if it's a P2S script, if it's a P2WS script, if it's a P2TR script, right? Depending on what script it is that your transaction is using, your dust limit varies. Okay. For P2H scripts, it's 240 sats. Now, Bitcoin Core version 2.0 introduces a pool policy called ephemeral dust. A transaction may have a single fee if the transaction pays zero fees, which requires it to be a truck transaction. Any transaction spending unconfirmed outputs from the zero fee parent must spend the dust output. As the zero fee parent transaction does not meet the minimum fee rate by itself, that generally means that it is submitted with the child transaction that immediately spends the dust output, making it FM, right? So with P2A, the dust limit is 240 sats. With ephemeral anchors, the dust limit is zero. It's absolutely zero. So ephemeral outputs are basically outputs that have a zero fee and zero amount. You can broadcast them without paying any fee. You can broadcast them without having a zero sat output. The only catch is that you cannot broadcast them independently. You will have to broadcast them along with the child, okay, and that child has to that entire package of the child and the parent is but due to time constraints, we'll confine ourselves to here. So what's P2TA basically? So if any of you are aware what dust outputs are, right, that is the minimum amount of that is the minimum amount that an output in a Bitcoin transaction must have in order for it to be considered a standard transaction and in order for it to be broadcasted. So if you go to Bitcoin, any of Bitcoin's popular clients, if you go to their source code and you see there is you'll find a find. I believe it's script.h. We'll find a list of standard scripts and their dust limit as well, right? So the lowest one currently is the P2A. If you're I mean, if your transaction is spending a P2A output, then the dust limit is 240 sats. And if it has an ephemeral anchor, then the dust limit is absolutely zero. All right. So that's our take from this question. That now hopefully you know that the lowest dust limit is 240 sats, which is for P2A. And even below that, there are outputs that have absolutely no dust limit. So if you see a transaction in your mempool or somewhere in mempool dot space which pays zero fee and it has a zero amount, and you get puzzled, how is it possible for a transaction to get mined when it's paying zero fee and it has zero amount, whereas we all know that there has to be a dust limit, right? So you know that that's an ephemeral anchor. An ephemeral anchor or an ephemeral output is a zero value, zero fee output, and P2TA is 240 sats. So if you look at this, you'll find 240 sats. The other day I was just going through it. I know my laptop is acting weird, but let's hope we go through the session because I've been using it nonstop for quite some time.
Like any justification for these kind of transactions? So
Depends on whether you buy those justifications or no. The justification is that these transactions are not broadcasted alone; they are broadcasted along with their parents, right? So, I mean, like, they will not. What do you say? Load the UTXO set because nobody's gonna broadcast them alone. People will have to attach a child with it, and so on and so forth. Now it depends on whether you buy that reason or whether you don't buy that reason, right? As far as
no,
ephemeral anchors are concerned, that they get destructed, they get destroyed. They don't live in the UTXO set. The
mhm.
moment you spend them, as long as they are there, they are there. The moment you spend them with a child, they get destroyed. That's why the name ephemeral. They don't live in the UTXO set. They get destroyed. But the P2A outputs, they will live there. They will live there.
Okay, PTA outputs they will live there. And
They
okay,
will live there.
so what if the child transaction was not created for the ephemeral transaction? So
It'll not broadcast, no, because it's a non-standard transaction. It will only be broadcasted if it has a child. I mean, it's a standard transaction, but like the thing is, no miner would want to mine a transaction that's not paying it any fee, right?
no,
If it has a
the fee does not have to come from that output, right?
yeah, but you're saying that if that transaction or if that output is the sole output in a transaction, then no miner would ever be inclined. There are two things. Firstly, if that is, let's assume that the transaction has only one output, okay, and it's an ephemeral output, zero value, zero fee, then
No, zero
morally
value, it
speaking,
cannot be
or
zero fee. No, if it is ephemeral output is zero value, then the miner will get all the input values. The sum of all the input will go to the miner, right? Because the output is zero in that case. So the miner will get the maximum fee possible.
how will the miner get the maximum fee possible?
No, because like you said, the ephemeral output is zero, so the input should have some value, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, we are talking about this individual output. It will not be broadcasted across the network. If we talk about it in isolation, if it is clubbed with other, so basically this has an OPC-SV. This has an OPC-SV until and unless this output is not individually mined. It has a OPC-SV of one blocks. So first the ephemeral output has to be mined. Only after that can the other outputs of the transaction get unlocked. So anybody who's mining this transaction, okay, will have to wait for one block for the other outputs to get unlocked. This comes with an OPC-SV, so it will not even propagate through the network, right? Because this transaction or this output on its own cannot be mined because it's an OPC-SV output. So until and unless this transaction is not mined or this output is not confirmed, other outputs cannot be confirmed. And that is why, and the other catch that I was coming to is that this is only compatible with V3 transactions or those which are known as struct transactions, right? So these ephemeral anchor outputs have to be version 3. They can't be version 2, they can't be version 1. They have to be version 3, and they need to have a parent which is also version 3, and then they become a package of a child and a parent, and then that package is broadcasted and the child pays for the parent, and then that package gets mined. And when the package of the child and the parent gets mined, after one block the other outputs of your commitment transactions get unlocked. So individually these transactions will not be broadcasted, because if you try to broadcast them as V1 and V2, the network will reject them. They're non-standard. They're only standard if they are V3, and for V3 transactions you need a child. So that parent and the child topology, that entire package is relayed. These transactions are never relayed. They cannot be relayed on their own. They'll be considered as non-standard. They will only have to be relayed as a package.
But even if it is not, sir, the miner will be able to create them if they want to.
Yes, they can, but it'll not be. I mean, even right now, it's possible for you to mine a zero fee, zero output transaction, right? The dust limits only apply for standardness reasons, right? A miner can
Yeah.
directly put it, even if it's V1, V2, the miner can still put it, right? But
Yeah.
V1 and V2, if it's zero output, then it will not broadcast through the transaction. But if it's V3, then it'll broadcast through the transaction as long as it has a child and the entire package is being relayed together.
Uh, Makes sense.
Great, thanks. Okay. We have 10 more minutes. Let's see how many can we cover. Okay, this will be an interesting one, even for the new ones. Let me see if how many folks are still with us. Okay, good turnout today. Hi, Abhishek. I'm seeing you for the first time. Nice to have you.
Nah, man, this is my third session, man. I just changed my profile photo. That's it. Okay.
Oh, all right. Okay, I only know through your
Yeah.
profile photo, no? So you changed it. You're a new person for me.
Next time I won't change it, man. This is done now.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Okay, fine. Next one. Okay. So the next question is up-to-date statistics about chain reorganizations. Up-to-date statistics about chain reorganization, right? I'm assuming most people here know what a chain reorganization is, right? When we have competing blocks, like for instance, there are two miners that are trying to mine a block, right? And let's assume both of them find a valid nonce at the same time, and both of them broadcast their blocks to the network, right? So the nodes that are closely connected to miner A will see the block of miner A first and propagate it to the network, and the nodes that are strongly connected to let's say miner B will see the blocks of miner B first and they'll propagate it to the network. Okay, so this situation is what we refer to as a block race. When two miners who are mining separate blocks find the valid nonce or mine a successful block at the same time, both of them will broadcast it to the network, right? Now there, because Bitcoin is a decentralized network, right? There's no central point of authority. There's no judge sitting and saying miner A was comes first and miner B comes second, right? It's propagated. The quicker the data is propagated, the more the more chances of that data reaching more nodes is better. So if let's say miner A is better connected to the network, its block will propagate across the network quickly, right? So in such a situation usually is known as a block race, where two or maybe more miners find a block simultaneously and they propagate across the network, right? Now only one block can be valid, right? Because you cannot have two blocks with the same height. Okay, right? If like there can only be one valid block at the same height. There can be multiple blocks of the same height, but only one will be considered as valid. The others will be referred to as tail blocks or orphan blocks, right? So this is a situation known as a block race. And when this happens, what happens? One of them is going to win, right? If two miners find a valid block at the same time, and both of them announced it to the network at the same time, both cannot be valid, right? Because only one valid block can have a specific height, right? Two valid blocks cannot have the same block index. So one of them is going to lose, one of them is gonna win, right? So let's say miner A and B both announced together. Miner A is connected to 60% of the nodes. So the 60% of the nodes believe that miner A has the right block. They received information from miner A, and then they started building on top of that. Okay, and let's say 40% of the nodes are connected with miner B, and they saw miner B's node first, and then they accepted that node, and then they started mining on top of that block which was mined by miner B, right? So now we have a temporary chain split. 60% of the network assumes that miner A's block is valid, and they're mining on top of miner A's block, and 40% of the miners believe that miner B's block is the valid block, and they're building on top of miner B's chain. So now we have a temporary chain split. Eventually one of them is going to win, right? Who wins? I'm sorry, the chain with the maximum proof of work eventually wins, right? So it's possible that okay, it's possible that miner A, for example, wins after one block. It might win after two blocks. It might win after three blocks, right? So let's say there are two chain splits. There's a chain split that's happened. One is going with miner A's block. The other is going with miner B's block, right? So let's say miner A adds one more block. So now miner A's chain has more proof of work and it'll win. Then eventually the other 40% nodes will recognize that miner A's chain is winning because it has more proof of work. They'll abandon miner B's block and they'll also start mining on top of miner A's block, right? So this split and merging again might happen after one block. It might have to happen after two blocks. It might happen after three blocks, right? So that is known as a reorg. When there's a temporary chain split due to a block race, okay, and then one chain, one version of the chain eventually wins because it has more proof of work, and then the chain which has less proof of work merges with the chain that has more proof of work. That's known as the reorganization or a reorg. This can happen after one block or two blocks. This race can go on for one block, race can go for two blocks, three blocks, four blocks. Eventually, when one version of the chain wins it and the other loses, right? And that's why most of you must have heard about this six block thumb rule, that whenever you get a Bitcoin transaction, do not consider it to be confirmed till six blocks are mined on top of it, because historically we have never had an organic six block reorg. We've had inorganic ones, like when the developers or Satoshi intentionally did a reorg because something wrong happened, right? For instance, maybe an inflation bug happened or something happened, so Satoshi himself, who had the digital signature to made changes and did a reorg. That's different, but we're talking about organic reorg that happens on its own. We've never had a six block reorg in the history of Bitcoin. As far as I can remember, I don't think there's even been a five block reorg. And a four block reorg is like very, very, very rare. Might have happened once, twice, or thrice in the entire history of Bitcoin, right? So that's why it's said that the possibility of a six block reorg happening is very, very low. So if you receive a Bitcoin transaction and it gets mined and six blocks are mined on top of that, then you can be sure that your transaction is confirmed. Now, obviously, this statistic varies with mining centralization. The most centralized mining is, the higher is the chance of a block reorg happening, right? But I think the question asks about how common are two, three, or four and four block reorgs nowadays? This question and similar ones have been asked a couple of times. See, for instance, here and here and here. But the most up-to-date answer in those dates from 2017, and the state of things has changed substantially since then. The closest I could find is the RSS feed, which only tracks something relatively similar, points in time where there were two distinct blocks at the chain tip's height. Let's see what the answer is. Since stale blocks, what are stale blocks? Stale blocks are basically blocks that were valid at some point in time and then they were rejected, right? So if miner A is mining on top of block A and minus B is mining on top of block B, miner A eventually wins, then the block of mining A which was racing will now be abandoned. It will be considered as a stale block. It lost the race. So since stale blocks and reorgs are ephemeral data, I've been collecting them in a data set, right? You can have this information archived, meaning you can have that information in a database on your node, but it will not be part of the blockchain. I've tried to add as many old stale blocks as I could find and tried to dig up the headers for them. Some contributors recently started adding the full stale blocks there too. Over the last years, it's been mostly one block reorgs. Okay, so recently or in the past few years, the maximum that the chain split and a block raise has lasted for is one block. The last two block reorg I'm aware of is of block such and such. Okay, I don't know when this happened. 2020, it says, maybe not after that. However, the hash and header of 7888685 are missing from my data. Before that one, I'm aware of a two block reorg at height such and such in November 20, right? So the answer says that since November 2020, only one block reorg have happened. And the last two block reorg that the answerer can trace is one which happened in November 2020. Right, so that's the answer. So like three block or four block reorgs are very rare. They happen very rarely. But like I said, the more decentralized mining is, the lesser is the chance of reorg. And the more centralized mining is, the higher is the chance of reorg. However, statistically, the last known or recorded two block reorg happened in November 2020. Right, that's what the question and that's what the answer is. If anybody has anything to add, please feel free to uh, speak out, and we'll probably take one more question, and we'll wind up at 9:05.
Yeah, the last question seems interesting. Does post quantum require hard fork or soft fork?
Great. Let's see. Any guesses? Hard fork or soft fork?
Uh, I think it requires a new address type, so I think it requires soft fork, or at least not necessarily a hard fork. That's what my hunch is.
Right. An answer that I expect from a lawyer. Does post-quantum require hard fork or soft fork? Okay. Suppose quantum computing has advanced, which becomes threats for Bitcoin. Okay. So just giving some context, you must have heard about quantum computing, and it is claimed that quantum computing is a threat to Bitcoin security because Bitcoin uses a certain elliptic curve to create public keys out of their private keys, and this mechanism is safe and secure because of the DLP problem, meaning you can with the private key you can find the public key, but with the public key you cannot find the private key. But if quantum computing succeeds and becomes a norm, then it is said that the DLP will be broken, and if somebody knows your public key, then they can find your private key. And we all know that the blockchain has a lot of public keys, right? All the coins that are associated with P2PK addresses, pay to public key addresses, that which are known as legacy addresses, their public keys are known, right? So though all those coins that are associated with addresses whose public keys are known, are available on the blockchain, all of those coins will be susceptible to threat. And if that happens, what measures will be taken? We covered a couple of weeks ago, but how will those measures be taken? Like, will we need a hard fork? Will we need a soft fork? That's what the question is, right? Let's read the question. Suppose quantum computing has advanced, which becomes a threat for Bitcoin. Is soft fork possible? If true, is hard fork impossible? If true, what happened with older UTXO? Okay, so let's read the answer. The threat of quantum computers is mainly that they would break Bitcoin's elliptic curve cryptography, meaning they could derive a private key from a public key, right? As we just discussed that, the threat of quantum computing to Bitcoin is a lot of people believe that SHA-256 will be broken. No, that's not the case. What's under threat is the elliptic curve cryptography. DLP will be broken. So if your public key is known as to someone, they can derive your private key using a quantum computer. There's also the potential threat to mining, but yeah, potential threat to mining because I mean, a quantum computer will be able to guess the nonsense much more quicker than the ASICs, and not everybody is going to have access to a quantum computer. A quantum computer is going to be very, very expensive, and very few people are going to have access to it initially. And with the ASICs, you won't be able to compete with it, right? So just like when people were mining with their computers and then CPUs, and then they started mining with the GPUs, CPUs were no match for GPUs. Then people started mining with GPUs, and then ASICs came. GPUs were no match for ASICs, right? Still, you can afford an ASIC for 1 lakh Indian rupees or 1,000 US dollars, right? But quantum computers are going to be very, very expensive. I believe they'll cost millions of dollars, right? They require an entire infrastructure to maintain, huge space, maybe negative temperature, right? So it's always going to be those big tech companies that are going to get their hands on quantum computers. And if that happens, then they'll have an undue advantage over people that are using ASICs and who cannot upgrade to quantum computers, right? So it's a threat to mining centralization as well. But here we are confining ourselves to the threat posed to elliptic curve cryptography, right? So the answer says there's also potential threat to mining, but I believe that's far less understood. It certainly is by me. So the following applies chiefly to the elliptic curve cryptography. The general solution to the quantum threat is to introduce a post-quantum TQC signature scheme, which could be done with a soft fork, right? So because if somebody knows your public key, then if the DLP is broken, then they can know your private key. If they know your private key, then they can generate a digital signature. If they can generate a digital signature, then they can sign the inputs and broadcast them, as we've discussed during the advent of the session, right? So that's the entire thread. Somebody knows your public key using the quantum computer, they can know your private key, and using your private key, they can generate a digital signature and spend your Bitcoins. So we will have to upgrade to a digital signature scheme which is quantum resistant, right? A PQC signature which is quantum computing resistant. That is what we'll have to do to combat quantum computing, which could be done with a soft fork. Now that's possible to be done with a soft fork, right? With a soft fork, you can upgrade to a digital signature scheme which is immune to what do you say, quantum computing, because ECDSA and SHA are susceptible to quantum computing. So we'll have to come up with new digital signature schemes that are immune to quantum computing. Then everyone would have to migrate their funds to PQC, right? So if you have any funds that are associated with P2 PK outputs, your public key is known, you immediately create a signature that is, you immediately create an address that is immune to quantum computers, and then you send your coins from your quantum vulnerable address to your quantum resistant address, which will only need a soft fork. Okay, the question then becomes what to do about coins locked with vulnerable public keys, right? What if people don't do it, right? What if somebody is not upgrading to a quantum resistant address? Or what about the coins that have been abandoned? Like there are so many coins, for instance, Satoshi's coins or other coins that have been abandoned for years, and nobody claims them, or lost coins, right? How do you upgrade them? Like the thieves or the thieves that have access to quantum computers will gain access to their private keys, and then they will create digital signatures and sign those coins and own those coins. So what do you do about them? One option is to do nothing and let the coins eventually be stolen by quantum attackers, right? One option is that you abandon those coins, right? All those coins that are abandoned, lost, or the owners don't want to upgrade to quantum resistant addresses. I mean, the onus is on them. If they lose their coins, they lose their coins. Another option is to make these coins unspendable with a soft fork after a set deadline. Okay, another option would be that you burn these coins. You give a deadline to all the people who own coins that are associated with quantum vulnerable addresses, and you give them a deadline to upgrade to a quantum resistant address. If they do not upgrade by that deadline, then instead of letting those coins get in the hands of bad boys, to destroy those coins, right? So some people will claim that it's better to destroy these coins instead of allowing these coins to get in the hands of bad boys. Yet another option is to make these coins unspendable using vulnerable signature scheme alone, and there are many ways to go about that, but all of them could be done with a soft fork. The only time we would need a hard fork is if we first want to make the vulnerable coins completely unspendable with a soft fork, and then later wanted to re-enable spending with a secure signature scheme, right? So the first scenario where a soft fork would suffice is when we upgrade to a quantum resistant digital signature scheme. Okay, that's very simple, and you send your coins to a quantum resistant address. That's when a soft fork would be required. When would a hard fork be required? Hard fork would be required in combination with a soft fork. So you, with a soft fork, you make all the coins that are associated with quantum vulnerable addresses unspendable. Then you do a hard fork, and with that hard fork, you introduce quantum resistant addresses, and then you make those coins spendable again. That would be a situation where a hard fork and a soft fork both will be required. So the question asks, when would a soft fork be needed? When would a hard fork be needed? So the answer explains when a soft fork would suffice, and in what situation would a hard fork be needed. However, I have never heard about anyone talking about a hard fork whenever they talk about quantum computing. They always talk about soft forks and introducing PQC signatures. And the bigger debate that we had a few weeks ago, that was also the controversy of the month of May, what to do with coins which are associated with quantum vulnerable addresses and the owners do not upgrade even after a deadline. Do we destroy them, or do we just abandon them and let the thieves get access to them, right? So depending on which school of thought you belong to. So that's the question about quantum computing. We're at 9:07, so I'll stop sharing my screen. That's all we were able to cover for the day. I'll be here for a couple of more minutes if anybody has anything to share, anything to say, any observations. Connected to the session directly, even if it's not connected to the session, anything about Bitcoin tech, please feel free to speak out.